how do you go from the root part of the process of being down into who you were and into rising again?
The first step that R is recognize that there is a loss. Because we don't have permission, because it's disenfranchised, we need to pause long enough to be able to say, ouch, that something hurt.
Yeah.
And then within that, and this is going to get a little bit technical here, but I think it's so important, is that there are visible losses. I lost my job. I lost my salary. I lost benefits. I lost my parking space. And then there are hidden losses. And it's the hidden losses that really get us, because we can go on to new jobs. We can replace the salary or get new benefits. But the impact on the hidden losses of identity, purpose, belonging, community, impact, if we don't find ways to replace those, then we're going to be continuing to carry the grief with us. The second step is the I, investigate the meaning, is that once a grief event happens, whether it's a single event like being fired or what I call death by 1,000 cuts, you've sent out 127 resumes and you hear nothing, it's like that becomes a grief event, even though it takes place over a course of time, is to look at the meaning that's being created from that event. So for me, the meaning that I created was, I'm a failure, I'm a loser, and I'm worthless.
Hi, all. Welcome back to the Realign and Rise podcast. Today, I have Laverne McKinnon. She's an executive coach, producer, speaker, and resilience advocate whose work bridges leadership, emotional well-being, and human resilience. With a career spanning more than 2 decades in entertainment media, Laverne held senior leadership roles at CBX, Epix, and she led development for Charlize Theron's production company. And she helped shape projects tied to major titles, including Netflix's Girl Boss and Pitch Perfect. But beneath the professional success, Laverne was navigating personal crisis. Laverne, I am so glad you're here, and I would just love to hear your story. Tell me what happened for you.
Some people are going to hear this story and say, how is that a personal crisis, not just a professional one? But I'm so happy to be here today and be a part of what you're doing and what you're putting out into the world of learning from the mistakes or face plants and failures that happen in one's life. So I was living the dream of my professional life. I was a small town girl, moved to Los Angeles. I became a part of the entertainment industry and I worked my way up the ladder. And I was really fortunate to be at CBS, the broadcast network that's responsible for CSI and all of those crime show procedurals. And so I worked my way up the ladder at CBS. I was promoted every 18 to 24 months. So it was a little bit of a skyrocket. And then out of the blue, I was fired. And this was a huge professional crisis for me. That was also a personal crisis as well, because I lost all sense of who I was, why I was here. And I got put into a spiral of, and I'm just jumping into the deep end here, of self-loathing.
Yeah.
And I know, even though I intellectually knew that I wasn't alone, I wasn't the first person to have lost a job, but I felt like a leper because I just felt so alone.
Yeah. And I think anybody who, when you go through those things, it feels like a denial, like a personal, like somebody really just attacks almost your entire character identity in those times. I can imagine that it really took you back to, all the things about yourself. Being sick, I went through an imposter syndrome moment of myself. When life kicks you back, you literally go through the moments where you question everything.
Yeah, I ruminated honestly for like 10 years thinking about an email that I sent, a conversation that I had, the time that I spoke up in a meeting when I should have just zipped it, and just like replaying these things over and over and over again. And even though I went on to other high profile jobs and was very successful, I was the first programming chief at Epix. And you've talked about some of the other things in my intro as well. I was haunted by the fact that I'd been fired and how much it impacted how I perceived myself, because I thought of myself as someone who was competent, who was capable. And a competent, capable person does not get fired. And so I had to start to understand, and it took me a decade to realize that I was grieving my job. But I've always associated grief with the loss of life. And I did not know that there's a category of grief called disenfranchised, which is any type of grief that's not openly acknowledged, socially validated, publicly mourned. And so the professional heartbreaks fall under that category of disenfranchised grief.
Well, and when you love something that you're doing, I mean, I love doing this. For someone to say to you, this is no longer, there is a sort of grief that goes into that, making you question everything. What was your response initially when it happened? I imagine, I mean, let's talk about grief for a second. You know, grief comes in all forms. Some people, they sit on their couch and eat ice cream and they become paralyzed. Some get angry. Some go out and try and prove them wrong, you know? What was yours?
I went into, like, my first reaction when, like, I was in the moment and my former boss was letting me know that that I was a liability, that things weren't good. And I'm a recovering people pleaser and a perfectionist. And I was also, quite frankly, I think I was in a codependent relationship with my boss. I'm writing a book right now about career grief. My second book is going to be about workplace codependency. But I became so concerned about her well-being. And so I immediately went into, like, if this isn't working, like, let's talk to my lawyer. We'll settle out my contract. And unfortunately, she was like, I'm not firing you, but I'm going to take away all of your responsibilities. So it was a very long, protracted experience of 4 months that it took for me to be officially fired. At the same time, my father was dying of cancer. And so I had these two things happening in my life. And what I realized is that while I was incredibly sad that my father was dying of cancer, he had lived a full life. And it made sense. What didn't make sense was the loss of my job. And that's where it was like, why am I thinking about this all the time when I should be with my heart, and my thoughts should be with my dad, but they were with my job. And so that was deeply disturbing to me. And I had a lot of shame around that as well. And then in retrospect, when I learned this concept of disenfranchised grief, and then I was experiencing career grief, all of those things that you were mentioning earlier about, like, how the body responds, I was like, oh, that's why my weight fluctuated, where I gained a lot of weight. I lost a lot of weight. I had a lot of difficulty sleeping. I would wake up in the middle of the night and never be able to go back to sleep. I had difficulty putting thoughts together. I had memory lapses. And these are all normal signs of grief. But I didn't know that I was grieving, so I thought that I was broken.
You know, another part of grief is the denial, and without going into all the details, because I think we only have a short amount of time on the show, but I think it's important. Do you feel as if when you were going through this that you agreed with her, or did that come to conclusion in a way that you grew from this, or was that this is absolutely wrong, this is not my fault? Did that ever grow for you or minimize, or how did that feel for you?
I could not pinpoint for me, okay, what was because I didn't get any negative feedback. It was everything was fine, and then suddenly it wasn't. And so in retrospect, after mourning that job, and again, this was 10 years later, that I started to put the pieces together, which is that I essentially had grown up in this job, and I was like a rebellious teenager. And because I had a senior leadership position, I thought that I had the permission to speak up, to have an opinion, to voice a concern, even behind closed doors. But the culture of the company at that time did not value independent thought. And so I'm like, hey, I've proven myself. I should be able to have an opinion. I did not read the room, and that my thoughts and opinions were not valued. So I think that there was a real tension between that. Was I angry that I didn't get feedback? Yes, because I would have done anything that I needed to do in order to succeed in that role.
I think it's important for people to hear, though, because a lot of people are losing their jobs right now, whether it's by choice, whether, by layoff, uh, by all kinds of reasons right now. But, our country's employment rates right now are changing dramatically. And I think that there are a lot of people who are going to listen to this and they're going to feel like they can relate with you in a way. And so as we move through this process of what happened to 10 years later, can we guide them into that next step of what realigning for you looked like? How did you shift? Because 10 years is a long gap to get back on the bike and start riding again per se. And so I think everyone's going to look for, well, how did you do that, Laverne? Because right now I feel stuck. I feel alone. I feel wronged. I feel, justified. There's a whole sort of emotions in this. How do you go from the root part of the process of being down into who you were and into rising again?
Yeah. I've codified the process into a framework that I call RISE. So, um,
Perfect.
that the first step, that R, is recognize that there is a loss. Because we don't have permission, because it's disenfranchised, we need to pause long enough to be able to say, ouch, that something hurt.
Yeah.
And then within that, and this is going to get a little bit technical here, but I think it's so important, is that there are visible losses. I lost my job. I lost my salary. I lost benefits. I lost my parking space.
Mhm.
And then there are hidden losses. And it's the hidden losses that really get us, because we can go on to new jobs. We can replace the salary or get new benefits. But the impact on the hidden losses of identity, purpose, belonging, community, impact, if we don't find ways to replace those, then we're going to be continuing to carry the grief with us.
Mm.
The second step is the I, investigate the meaning, is that once a grief event happens, whether it's a single event like being fired or what I call death by 1,000 cuts, you've sent out 127 resumes and you hear nothing. It's like that becomes a grief event, even though it takes place over a course of time, is to look at the meaning that's being created from that event. So for me, the meaning that I created was, I'm a failure, I'm a loser, and I'm worthless. That's not a way to keep moving forward. And so we want to look at the meaning that's been created and rewrite that as necessary. And then the third step is about regaining agency. It's like shifting into agency, because when we have a grief event, we are oftentimes left feeling helpless, hopeless, and powerless. And so we create a bespoke ritual to help honor the loss, just like we do for loss of life. There's a memorial, a funeral service, we sit Shiva. We create a ritual to have a good goodbye. So if a project failed, an entrepreneur's business has collapsed, we create rituals around that. And then the final step is embark on what's next. And so it's making certain that you really identify a step to take in order to move forward that honors your unique values and your unique purpose. And so that brings us back again to this place of empowerment.
I like that rise. That's great. So for someone who is listening, we talked about it in each step. What what did that look like for you in your next step? You've gone on to work on other projects. What do you do now? Tell us a little bit about what that looks like.
Well, as I was going through this mourning process, I had to go back to the basics and be like, what is important to me? What are my values? And why am I here? Because I had conflated and I thought that my purpose was my job. So when I lost my job, I have no purpose, but that's absolutely inaccurate. Our purpose is our reason for being. Our jobs and our careers are a manifestation of our purpose. So when I got clear on that, I realized that my purpose is about helping people across their finish line. So I would do that as an executive when I would buy projects from writers and directors and actors that help them move their careers forward. I do that as a professor. I teach at Northwestern University, and so I'm helping students get across their finish line. And I do this now as an executive coach, really helping people with transitions. Because so oftentimes in the professional realm, when there's a heartbreak, people immediately interpret that as a decline.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's not a decline, it's a transition. And grief, and it's very core, grief is about integrating a loss into who we are becoming.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I do today. And honestly, that was like the most healing part of it, was to realize that, well, I was never going to be able to get that job back. It didn't mean that I had lost my purpose, and I could still make a contribution to our world in a positive way.
You know, I'm sitting here and I'm smiling because when you talk about grief, grief isn't just losing a job, or I mean, it comes in all forms. And for me, I went through a sense of grief in its stages in chronic illness, where I went from being a high functioning leader, you know, running 9 miles a day, running businesses in 34 states. And then when I hit chronic illness, my whole life stopped. And, you know, I was just saying this on a previous podcast that the first year you go through this, I got it. I'm in control. I can take over and I'll fix this. It just is going to take a little bit more time. It's, you know, medicines or this or that. And then the second year, the grief started to hit, and I was in denial and I was angry, and I found myself like looking for that purpose. Why am I here? I would call my mom and I'd say, what? I don't understand what I'm trying to be taught right now about my life. And so you go through those stages and they all look so different, but grief is just a fascinating thing to me because it can show up in so many different ways and you can fight it in so many different ways. And then when you look at it in the end, purpose is so differently perceived versus what you went through. And it's like this, ah, there is that there is purpose in all of that pain that we went through. So it is an interesting thing from this perspective for me to be going through it as well. I'm curious for you, if you were to look back in your purpose, do you have regrets since you were let go? Do you feel it's held you back in any way?
I believe that the universe was tough loving me, because I would have stayed at that company for the rest of my life. And I would not have been able to, I don't believe, meet my full potential, because I wanted to work in corporate America because I believe that it was stable. And I come from a lower income household. And so my relationship with money has always been very challenging, because I just grew up with a belief that there's never going to be enough. And so I thought, I'll just get a job. I will kill it. I'll do so, I'm going to just like be amazing. And they're never, and that's just not the reality. And mentioned earlier, just like what's going on, in terms of the economy and industries collapsing, artificial intelligence, which, like, I'm not pro or con AI. Just the reality is that AI is replacing jobs.
Yeah.
And McKinsey has released a study that says that over 300 million jobs will be replaced by AI by the year 2030. Now, a lot of people will be able to make a transition and do something new, but it doesn't change the fact that they lost the thing that they had been doing that was a big part of their identity.
Yeah. Tell me, for someone who is going through this right now, I'm sure that they've put everything down and they've really started to pay attention, like, okay, maybe this is part of that purpose for me as I'm looking for a new job or I'm stepping into something new. What advice can you give them as they go into this and rising in their new purpose? What would you tell them for this week?
Yeah. That purpose is like breathing, that it's always with you. You're not conscious of it typically, but when you are and you can pause and go, let me just take a breath in, and it's like a nicer long exhale, that taking the moment this week to pause and say, what's my purpose? And I'm just going to break this down a little bit more. There's a little formula that I use to help people determine what their purpose is. And it's answering 3 questions. The first is, what brings you joy? The second is, what do people tell you that you're good at? And then the third is, what breaks your heart? And so, in combining those things, what brings you joy, what you're good at, and what breaks your heart, they will formulate into identifying and articulating your purpose. And so I'll just use myself as an example again. Conversations like this, listening, it brings me so much joy. People tell me that I'm really good with strategy, creating processes, creating frameworks. And then what breaks my heart is I hate to see anyone suffering or think that they're less than because of something that happened in their career. I believe as a society, we over-index on our careers as being the most important thing in our lives. And so I want to try to rebalance that. But if you could just spend just a few minutes just answering those 3 questions, it'll help you start to articulate why you're here.
I really like that. I never would have thought about that third question in the same way that way. Now I
Yeah.
actually, even in just sitting down, I want to sit down tonight and go through those 3 questions again. Can you repeat those for one more time for the listener? Because I want to make sure they hear those.
Yeah, absolutely. What brings you joy? And I'll just add a little caveat of don't edit. Because I love to read, and I never knew that I could have a job where I would get paid to read. So do not edit. And then second is, what do people tell you that you're good at? Oftentimes we're so good at something, we don't actually recognize it as a talent or skill. And then the third one is, what breaks your heart?
What breaks your heart? So good. Thank you so much for being here, Laverne. I really appreciate your time. Where can listeners connect with you and learn more about your work, your frameworks, and maybe work with you further?
I would love for people to check out my website, lavernmckinnon.com. It has all of my social, all of the different ways people can work with me. And there's also an opportunity to sign up for my newsletter, which comes out weekly, that has really, I'm just going to pat myself on the back here. It has really, really good information and stories to help people with career transition, whether you're moving up or off or onto the ladder.
Well, I appreciate your time. And I want to check out that newsletter. That was great. Before we wrap, if you're navigating pressure, transition, caregiving, leadership fatigue, or all the emotional weight of rebuilding from something in your own life, I also have a newsletter where I share leadership insight. It's where I break down how to apply those conversations in real life, especially during seasons that require resilience, discernment, responsibility, no matter what it looks like. And you can find that at MairinMooreCane.com. But before we wrap, I want to remind you, you don't have to be hold to lead. You just have to root right where you are. Leadership doesn't begin once everything is resolved. It begins when you root yourself in that truth, you realign with what matters, and you choose to rise with responsibility right where you are. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.